Okay, hi. This video is going to go through D4, which is continuity and change of ecosystems. I'm going to do essentially one full page on each of the three parts. So D4.1 is natural selection, D4.2 is stability and change, and then D4.3 is climate change. By all means, you can use more than one page because I write pretty small to fit it on one page. So feel free to do it however it works for you. It's just my way of kind of forcing myself to summarize by giving it some sort of limit. We'll get going. So when we do D4.1, there's a little bit of overlap with some things that come up in A4 in terms of evolution, but this here, the emphasis is really on natural selection. So we're going to cover natural selection. And just a reminder that natural selection has been called by the almighty IB a paradigm shift. So it's really a whole new way of thinking about evolution. So they already thought evolution existed prior to natural selection, but it was a new way of thinking about it. And specifically from Lamarckism, that's actually more in A4, so we won't go specifically into the details again of Lamarckism, but just kind of that term paradigm shift got noted here. One thing I want you to make a note of is if you are writing about natural selection to a prompt, which is really common, like they won't just say write about it, they'll say in this example, make sure you refer in your response to the example at every place. So I'm just going to make a note, kind of refer to the specific trait at each step. So as I go through this example, I'm going to do the example of the tawny owl, just because it's in the course kind of at the end of D4.3, so it's worth kind of following through on that. Just as an example of what I mean by making sure at every step you're kind of referring to it. So the whole reason it was a paradigm shift is because of the emphasis on it being genetic or heritable at the time that Darwin said it, but we're going to kind of do a bit of a neo-Darwinism approach and go straight into the kind of genetics. So it must begin with genetic variation. So the key word there is genetic, because prior to that, it was looking at kind of traits that were adapted during the lifetime. So must begin as genetic variation. The other thing you need to be able to account for is essentially what are the sources of that genetic variation. So where does the genetic variation come from? So essentially any new alleles, so new alleles initially come from mutation. So mutation or change in the DNA is the only kind of source of brand new alleles. But there's two other things that have a big role in recombination of alleles. So new allele combinations is actually a factor of sexual reproduction. So in sexual reproduction, we create new combinations, not actually new alleles. And there's two kind of ways to note that, times that happens. So first of all, it happens in meiosis itself. So in meiosis, when we make gametes, there's a lot of recombination, and that recombination particularly happens in crossing over. That's kind of a different topic, so I'm not going to go into it a lot now. We'll talk about that when that's that topic, but it's just in meiosis, because of crossing over and independent assortment, we get new combinations. And then the other thing is kind of random fertilization. So each gamete has different combination of chromosomes. So every zygote, which is just the baby, has different chromosome combinations. So it is good to recognize that we still are saying mutation is the initial one. So if we're getting a brand new variation brand new allele. It has to come from mutation, but those other things can change the combinations, which can change physical features. So again, if I was doing an example, and I'm going to use my example of the tawny owl, I would want to say that there was a pre-existing. So again, it must begin with. So that has to pre-exist. So there's existing variations. And you can call it a polymorphism, which just means two variations already exist in the population. So it's not a normal and a mutant, there's just a natural kind of two forms. And that is of gray, which are really light, and brown tawny owls. So I'm making sure that I clarify where the variation was already there. Next thing is I need to introduce the idea that there is some sort of threat to survival. So if everybody's surviving, natural selection isn't going to happen. So populations or individuals, we can say, individuals face threats to survival. And kind of two main categories, kind of three examples of what those threats to survival can look like. So first of all, they can be triggered by abiotic factors. So abiotic factors. And any of those factors lead to what's called a selective pressure. So that can be things like temperature, rainfall, drought, things like that. So that is an abiotic thing if it's related to kind of climate, drought, things like that. And then the other examples, we can have biotic factors. And the general example for that comes from kind of two things. So there's a tendency towards overpopulation, so exceeding the carrying capacity. And when we exceed the carrying capacity, it leads to competition for resources. So overpopulation leading to competition. And then the other abiotic factor is just going to be predation. And that's closely linked to overpopulation as well, because remember, predation does increase in more crowded populations. So that does kind of increase. So the three main ones are going to be an abiotic factor, some sort of competition, or a predator. So again, if I was actually looking at my example with my tawny owls, the actual threat that we would be talking about in this case would be predation. So example, tawny owls have predators. So that is my threat that I'm going to specifically keep talking about. Then, in certain environments, based on the selective pressures, some organisms have an increased chance of survival or reproduction. So some variations are more successful. I'm going to just leave it successful for right now. Under those selective pressures. So all are not equal, and it does relate to what are the selective pressures. So basically under those pressures or in that environment, some are going to be more successful than others. A couple of different things. So the variations that are more successful, we are now going to call adaptations. So that's going to be our term for the variation that is better. So let's talk about what successful looks like. So when we say successful, there's kind of two categories that can fit into. So the first is it increases their likelihood of survival. That's kind of classic natural selection, but there is actually a sub kind of category where it actually increases attraction to mates. So that's actually kind of a little subcategory of natural selection. And when there is no survival difference, but there is a mate attracting difference, we actually call that sexual selection. on the source, I think the syllabus kind of looks at it as a aselective pressure within natural selection. Can also argue it's actually just actually like a parallel process to natural selection. So sexual selection is similar to natural selection, but without the survival component. So kind of either way. And there are some instances where these two even are in competition with each other. So in some cases, they're kind of both at play. And so generally speaking, survival is most important. But if survival is done, then this can actually take an impact. So kind of two examples worth kind of noting that were in the course, both of which discuss kind of that idea that they can both play a role. So one is the birds of paradise. And what's interesting about the birds of paradise is their bright feathers are actually an actual attraction to predators. So if they have it actually is against their survival, but its ability to attract mates is so strong that it actually trumps that. So as their attractiveness to mates, essentially if they have the duller feathers, even though they might survive longer, they essentially cannot attract mates. So it shows that it's a really important thing that you have to kind of look at both, because in that case, it actually, the sexual selection pressure actually trumps the survival pressure. The other one that we looked at was John Inler's kind of guppies. And he actually found that the bright colors only existed when there was no predators. So when there were predators, the survival advantage trumped the mating advantage, but in the absence of real predators, then the mating advantage did. So it was basically bright only without predators. So it just kind of looks at two examples that have to balance both of those things. And sometimes one wins out more than the other because you have to survive, but you have to survive and be able to attract mates. So that's just a little tiny sub thing. Either way, the one with the variation is going to make more offspring. So whether it's because they survive longer and just have therefore more opportunities to mate, or specifically because they attract more mates, either way they create more offspring. So let's look at our example, because we always want to back it up to our example. So in this case, the environment has changed significantly. So due to less snow, therefore darker forests actually are better for the brown owls. And the reason is going to be camouflage and therefore less predators. So you want to actually spell out kind of what is the adaptation. So here's the variation. Now, what is the actual adaptation involved? So again, instead of surviving, I'm going to very specifically, so that I can include both, say individuals with the adaptation produce more offspring. And that's really the key. So that kind of encompasses both, because that explains the possibility that it's due to mating or that it's due to survival. So that's going to be our key. And so they are going to be the ones that actually have the most offspring. So if I want to give my example, so I'm going to say brown owls reproduce more. So in this case, they are going to have more offspring due to increased survival. So in some cases, the being less hunted means they actually have the chance to survive more. Other times it's more linked to the actual attracting of more mates. And then we come back to because it was a genetic variation, therefore they pass on their genes more. And just a quick definition, whoever passes on their genes more, we do say is the most fit, which is a kind of term, survival of the fittest, that Darwin established. And because that variation is genetic, they pass on their genes, including the heritable variation. And so what happens is, because they are passing on more, so more of the variation, what that is going to result in is going to be an increase in the number of brown owls. So there's going to be more brown owls each generation. And then over time, you're going to see an increase in the frequency of the adaptation. So an increase in the frequency of the better adapted variation. If you're writing about this, so for instance, if you were writing about the brown owls, I generally advise writing about it from a positive. So instead of saying, therefore the white gray owls die and kind of going all at it from the negative angle, my thought is always to say the brown owls are more successfully, they survive and reproduce, therefore that goes up in frequency, and the implication then is that the other goes down in frequency. So increase in frequency of the adaptation, and so basically increase in the brown owls. And that change in frequency, so anytime you change the frequency, that equals change over time. And change in a trait over time equals evolution. So evolution is kind of my end result of that process. Okay, a couple of little things to add to that. I'm probably going to have to erase it because I didn't quite fit. But one other little thing is when we talk about evolution, the other thing that is here, so we said sexual selection is basically a version of natural selection, so it happens the same way by kind of survival of the fittest. But one kind of alternative can also occur not due to this natural process whereby they just actually produce more offspring by their own traits, but by selective breeding. And that's going to be when humans actually select the trait. So humans actually come in and select which one they're going to actually mate. And when we do that, we do not call it natural selection. So natural selection has to be left to selection pressures and breeding. So if we came in and did that, it is not natural selection, it is artificial selection. So just like a little reminder of that vocab term as a little alternative idea. I'm going to do like one more little thing, but I've just run out of room. The other one to kind of remember as an example, so I did the example of the brown owl, but maybe make a note that another example that comes up a lot is antibiotic resistance. So that's an example whereby the bacteria have a naturally existing variation in their cell wall. There's some sort of threat to survival, which is the introduction of the antibiotic. So it's kind of a different one. So you have to kind of play around with that a touch there and recognize that the introduction of the antibiotic, which is something that humans have done, is actually introducing the threat to survival. So it can be kind of a human-made threat. Now the ones that have the cell wall that does not respond to the antibiotic are now more successful. So that is an adaptation. It increases their survival significantly because the others all die. Therefore, they have more offspring because they reproduce, passing on their resistance, and therefore increases the variation over time. Okay, one other little thing that I just ran out of time for before we get to Hardy-Weinberg. So I'm just going to erase and just do a mini version of it. And then I want to finish this section with Hardy-Weinberg. And I'm going to try to remember to flag when it's HL material, because I've been doing these videos to the HL course, but trying to remember to tell you, oh, this is HL. So this is a little HL only. So when those happen, if you were doing standard level and revising for final exams with these, you can know I don't need to remember that part. So what you have to look at there is the 3 natural selection patterns. Or outcomes. And these are specifically for continuous traits. So in the previous example, What I actually looked at was 2 options only, so gray or brown, resistant or not resistant, and so it's going to increase the frequency of one, decrease the other. So it's a little bit more straightforward, it's just one over the other. When we say continuous, that just means more than 2 options, and another word for that is polygenic. So that usually means it's more genes. So as a result of many genes, there's more than 2 traits. So it's not just this variation or this variation, it's like a continuum. And when that happens, there's 3 general patterns. I'm gonna go through pretty quickly because I think they're pretty easy, so we're just gonna do it with little graphs. So anytime you have a polygenic trait, just by sheer statistical chance, you're gonna see that the most common outcome is the average. So that's just kind of a statistical thing that is gonna fall on kind of a normal continuum. So that's kind of the general idea, that this is kind of the low, this is the high end of the trait, and you're gonna see most people in the middle. So that's just kind of a constant thing, and this would be, of course, frequency. So low, high, frequency for the trait. Okay, so sometimes what happens is one variation is better. So it is definitely better to be high than low. And so you're not going to remove the variation because of many genes being irresponsible. You're always going to see variation, but the variation is all going to just move out. So there's still variation, but everything moves in that direction. So examples for that might be speed in organisms that run from prey. Height has done that essentially in humans, where still variation, but everyone is taller. The other possibility is that it's better to be in the middle, and there's actually plenty of kind of medical traits that there's kind of a desirable balance, and either extreme is not ideal because the body works best in the middle. And if that happens, you're going to see less of either of the extreme, and you're going to see a higher peak in the middle. So, I was going to give you the names for these. This is directional selection. Example for that is weight, birth weight in particular. So risks involved at high or low. That's called stabilizing selection. And then the other possibility is that being in the middle has no advantage, but either extreme does. So a good example for this is like coloration. So if we looked at our moths, our owls as the example, but the moths are the same. A darker coloration is camouflage in one environment, a lighter is a camouflage in another environment, but being in the middle actually doesn't provide camouflage anywhere. So that often ends up falling into that pattern, and that's called disruptive selection. Okay, so that was just a little bonus little HL thing. I'm going to erase just so that I don't have to write tiny at the bottom, but hopefully, and just spot check on my page, I'm nearing the end of my page, so if you've been writing super tiny, you can write a little bit bigger now. So the last part, which is also HL only, is we want to talk a little bit more about allele frequencies. So again, we say the variation in the trait, and if the trait is genetic, then in theory we could track that to change in the actual allele. So when we actually do that, when we really study it at an allele level, a lot of times that's called microevolution. It can also be called population genetics. You could just call it neo-Darwinism as kind of a subcategory of that. So different kind of terms for it. But the key is now, instead of looking at just the phenotypes or the variation in general, we're actually tracking change in allele frequencies over time. Sometimes you'll track this and you actually may not even detect a change in the phenotype. So it's really a zoomed in way of looking at it specifically at the allele level. When we say microevolution, it's worth noting that there is an opposite to that. So evolution on this kind of micro scale is essentially the opposite of genetic equilibrium. And genetic equilibrium means no change in allele frequencies over time. So that's going to basically mean stable or no change, so same frequencies over time. And so Hardy-Weinberg kind of have two important things that you need to know. So first of all, they talked a lot about genetic equilibrium and what it would actually require for that to happen. So they came up with 5 conditions needed to stay in genetic equilibrium. And then they also came up with a way to calculate allele frequencies. So they're kind of two separate things. One is more of a theoretical explanation and the other is more of a hands-on manipulation of the data. So we'll look at both. So according to Hardy and Weinberg, to stay in equilibrium, you need 5 conditions. And it requires all 5. So in other words, you can't just have most of them. You need to have all 5 of these conditions. Okay, the conditions are, you just need to memorize them. It's not much else to say about that, but you have to have a large population size. It's outside the realm of your course to have to totally understand why for each one. So I'm not going to waste our time going into population bottlenecks and genetic drift because it's not in the syllabus, but that is why. The second thing is you can't have any gene flow. So that can be listed as no immigration. I think they list it as no immigration or emigration, which is a very fancy way of saying no one leaves, no one enters. But the heart of that is no gene flow. So you can't have kind of constant change in the population in terms of who lives there. You can also, if you draw a blank, just say nobody moves. You need to have random mating for that trait. So the other 2 are more general. So it doesn't have to be random mating for every trait, but it does have to be random mating for that trait. So if we were tracking blood types, it means you can't ask someone their blood type before you decide whether you have babies with them. So for that trait, mating has nothing to do with the trait. Similar to that one, for that trait, you also have to have no survival advantage, so no selective advantage. So if there is one variation or allele that provides an advantage, then obviously natural selection is going to cause that one to become more frequent, so you are going to see evolution. And then you have to have no new mutations. So of course mutations are going to happen at random, but you can't have mutations that generate new alleles. So if you have a new allele popping up through mutation, then that's going to change your frequencies. So you need to not have kind of significant mutations that change your alleles. Okay, so you have to have all 5. If any one is missing, then the population will evolve. So if any one of those is violated, their proposal is the population will change, allele frequencies will change. It could be due to natural selection, but it could not be. It could be due to sexual selection, it could just be due to gene flow, it could be a genetic drift, so there's all different reasons for that, but you need all 5 of those for it to stay stable. Okay, so then their other contribution, so our same friends here, Hardy and Weinberg, they also said, well, if evolution is change in allele frequencies, then how do we calculate those? So Hardy and Weinberg developed formulas to allow us to actually calculate these. Because remember, this is a bit of genetics. We don't know alleles, we only know phenotype, and because the dominant phenotype is usually shared between dominant homozygous and heterozygotes, we can't just look at people and tell their genotype for most traits. So we need a formula to be able to detect this. So who knows, it doesn't, hoping that the course isn't mean and doesn't specifically ask you to do a lot of Hardy-Weinberg calculations, but I'm gonna spend 5 minutes on it in case. So what are the 2 formulas? So the formulas are P plus Q equals 1. The most important thing for these formulas is you know what those actually mean. So P is the dominant allele, so that would be like the big A allele. And Q is going to be the recessive allele, which is the little a allele. If you found it easier to write dominant and recessive, you can. I was just running out of space, to be honest. So those are the alleles should add up to 1. Then the next formula, which they actually mathematically did just by multiplying P plus Q times P plus Q, they got was P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared also equals 1. And this formula relates to genotypes. So now P squared is the big A genotype. So that's going to be homozygous dominant. 2PQ is the heterozygote genotype. And Q squared is going to be the homozygous recessive genotype. Remember that my homozygous recessive genotype is my only group that has its own phenotype. So whoever has the little a genotype expresses a recessive phenotype. So we always have to start by calculating that. So to solve, and again, I know I'm going quickly, but there's going to be a lot to cover in this topic. So this is under the assumption you have some idea of how to do this, and this is just a reminder. So if you are asked to use the equations, because of the fact that Q squared is the only one with its own phenotype, you have to solve for Q squared first. So first, you must solve for Q squared. And I'm going to put a big star. This is really important. It will mess up your problem if you don't start with that. So if we are solving for Q squared, it's going to be the number with the recessive phenotype over the total population size. So that's going to be a proportion. Sometimes they may give that to you in the question. So check if they give it to you as a percent. They've already given you that. So every now and then they'll be nice and they'll give you Q squared. But if they don't and they give you the number, you can work it out that way. Then second, you're going to use that to solve for Q. And that's just a mathematical fact, is that if you have Q squared, you're just going to take the square root of that, and that will give you Q. Third, you now have Q, and according to up here, P plus Q is 1. So then you're going to solve for P, and that's going to be 1 minus Q. After that, once you have P and Q, you can basically do whatever else you want in whatever order. So I'm just going to write then. Then you can calculate P squared and 2PQ if asked. And hopefully that's pretty obvious to you. So P squared is just P times P, which you just worked out. 2PQ is 2 times P times Q. They may not ask you for that. If they're actually only tracking allele frequencies, then you maybe just need to do the 2 alleles. So depends on what they're asking for. So I always say, remember to answer the question. ATQ, answer the question. So check, does it ask you for a percent? Does it ask you for genotype frequencies? Does it ask you for carriers? So depending on how it's asked, it could change what you really need to kind of actually give. One last little note on allele frequencies, which is another little HL, which by the way, sorry, I probably should have made this much more clear from the beginning. So reminder, this whole area is HL only, including this last little point, which is just to recognize that in geographically isolated populations of the same species, allele frequencies often differ. So geographically isolated populations, even of the same species, often have different allele frequencies. It could lead to speciation, but there's more kind of required. So remember, speciation, you have to have a reproductive barrier. So in this case, you could say, okay, well, they're isolated. The human population, for instance, we are all one species because there's always the possibility of migration, therefore gene flow. But due to the largely separated nature of it, we do see these kind of differences in allele frequencies. And a really good example of that is ABO blood type. So if you look it up, it varies significantly, from type O being anywhere from 35% up to about 60% in some countries. So quite a lot of variation there. And that's just because of kind of initial isolation of populations, meaning slightly different allele frequencies. Okay, so that's all things 4.1. I'm going to erase and then we'll start 4.2. Okay, so we are looking now at 4.2, stability and change, which has a fair amount of overlap on some stuff we've talked about before in terms of biodiversity. So this is talking more about the whole ecosystem sustaining itself and not necessarily specifically about the diversity of it, but just the ability to maintain itself. So they're going to look similar, so similar concepts, but they do actually have a slight kind of different focus. So we're going to start with kind of the 4 requirements for sustainability. We're going to look at kind of real life example, mesocosm example, go into a couple of the applications in terms of some concerns, and then some kind of go from there. So it'll all work out. So what are the 4 requirements for ecosystems to be sustainable? So when we say long-term stability, so stability doesn't mean zero change or sustainability. So when we say stability, it means kind of same over time. Sustainability is very, very similar, but basically it means like self-sustaining, meaning not requiring kind of outside interference to be stable. So some ecosystems are stable, but only with a fair amount of outside influence. So this is going to be long-term ecosystem sustainability. So staying stable over a long period of time on their own. Okay, so hopefully these should be pretty straightforward. So first of all is that you have to have sufficient energy for life. So you have to have sufficient energy for all living organisms. And that's kind of 2 things. The first main thing is that you're going to have enough producers. So there is generally adequate access to sunlight for ecosystems, but you have to have enough producers to make the glucose. And you have to basically have kind of balanced trophic levels. And we'll talk a little bit about that below, but you basically have to have enough producers, but then you also have to have enough at every trophic level to sustain. If you have a lot of producers, but then way too many primary consumers, you can end up with overgrazing, and then you can't sustain that way either. So there's kind of multiple kind of factors there, but everybody has to have enough energy ongoingly. The second factor you need to have is recycling of nutrients. So when we say nutrients, what do we mean by that? So for instance, that can be carbon. So having enough carbon, your carbon should be kind of a sustainable thing. It can be nitrogen, phosphorus, water, any of the things that are gonna, probably not water necessarily, more hydrogen, but it does cycle as well, but essentially you have to have those kind of elements that are going to be needed. 2 things that are really important for that is decomposers. So decomposers are crucial. So you have to have enough decomposers to do the recycling. And the other thing that's crucial when we start looking at harvesting is you need to not have biomass being removed, because if biomass is being removed, then it doesn't get decomposed in the environment, and then you're losing nutrients from the environment. So the other crucial thing is to not remove too much biomass. So we'll kind of come back to that in a minute as kind of one of our applications, is we have to be really careful with harvesting. The third requirement is that you need to have, partly because every trophic level is important, but you need to have genetic diversity on your individual species. And that kind of comes back to here, because essentially that's going to help us avoid extinction. And every species has a role, and so we want to be careful. Important on all species, but it's particularly important for keystone species. So particularly for our keystone species. And remember, our definition of a keystone species is a species that has a disproportionate role in terms of maintaining stability. So it's not necessarily a largely populated organism, but it is really important for kind of maintaining everything in balance. A really common example is apex predators, but not all apex predators are keystone species, and not all keystone species are apex predators. Predators, interesting. Sorry about that. Predators. So that's a common example of a keystone species. That's about all I'm going to say due to speed about that, because they're pretty straightforward. If there was to be an extinction of them, it could lead to a trophic cascade, which is essentially kind of impacts on every layer, and then that's going to come back up here to this. So if you start having a trophic cascade, it means your trophic levels get unbalanced, and then everybody doesn't get the energy they need, and it has kind of a follow-on effect. And then the last one, which is probably honestly the most challenging at the moment, is that your climate or abiotic factors need to remain within the zone of tolerance. So they need to stay within the zone of tolerance of the organisms in the ecosystem. And so right now, climate change is kind of putting that at risk in a lot of ecosystems. So it's causing abiotic factors to shift and shift outside of the tolerance ranges. And so one of the things that ecosystems that are otherwise able to maintain that are struggling with kind of condition 4. Okay, so 2 different ecosystems that I want to look at in terms of stability that are both kind of named. So first of all, we want to look at a real life example of an ecosystem that has been sustainable up until fairly recently. And then we want to look at kind of a model or experimental example and talk about how mesocosms provide an example of this. So kind of 2 examples of looking at sustainable ecosystems. So our real life example that's kind of named in the syllabus that you'd want to be able to link to is the Amazon rainforest. So the Amazon rainforest is really interesting because part of what's made it sustainable is it actually regulates its own water cycle. So that kind of comes into this one here, because one thing that can challenge ecosystems if they have droughts and periods where their abiotic needs are not met. And so part of why, first of all, it has tons of producers, so lots of producers, and then also it maintains its own water cycle. Due to maintaining its own water cycle. And the fact that it is able to maintain its own water cycle is because of it having lots of producers. So that is due to plant life. And it's an extra benefit of the plant life. So not just the energy, but also that. Just a tiny short dot point on how that happens is basically when you have lots of plant life, there's actually so much transpiration, particularly if you have like a really big canopy. So lots of kind of high up plant life, and that transpiration from the canopy is actually what forms its own clouds, and it then leads to the precipitation. So it sustains its own rainfall without kind of bigger picture climate patterns, which helps it to be more sustainable. However, at the moment, due to deforestation, we're losing plant life, and the loss of plant life is causing there to be a reduction in that transpiration. Means it's no longer able, or it's kind of close to in areas, so it's not all gone, but no longer able to sustain that. In some areas, particularly kind of around the edges, you see it more. So essentially loss of plant life, no longer able to sustain this because we need that transpiration. And so it's starting to lose its sustainability. So then it might be less or unsustainable And again, not across the board, but there are certainly areas that are essentially no longer forest. And the idea of it reaching that point where it's no longer sustainable would be referred to as the tipping point. So once it kind of goes over into that point where it's not sustainable anymore, it is called a tipping point. Okay, that's kind of a real life version. The model classroom version that we looked at are mesocosms. And one thing that's really cool about a mesocosm, so first of all, it's a good reminder to make sure you have everything. So you have to have enough producers, you have to have decomposers to do your cycling. The genetic diversity isn't as important because a lot of times we only use kind of one species and it's a smaller scale. And then things like it should be able to then, kind of like this, it actually does its own kind of cycling of abiotic factors, which is pretty cool. So particularly if you do like a sealed terrarium, then that's really cool because what it actually means is that no matter enters. So it's all recycled. So it's just a cool kind of way of looking at that recycling of the nutrients and also ensuring that you're not having input. For instance, even your CO2, so your carbon dioxide and oxygen will cycle naturally because of photosynthesis and respiration, but your CO2 can actually build your biomass. So your actual terrarium can gain biomass, but it actually is the same matter. So it's just restructuring of the matter. So kind of a cool example where you can actually see that really clear recycling of things like carbon. Important that it does need to have a plant. It needs to have decomposers, usually found in the soil. So most of the time when we use established soil, it'll already have decomposers in there and soil with nutrients. And like the Amazon, it'll need to have water at the onset, so either in the soil or sprayed in, but then it will actually do this same thing where it will actually form its own little water cycle. It won't necessarily precipitate, but it'll condense on the sides and then that comes back down. So kind of a cool example on a small scale where you can see that actually happen. There is just a little term that might come up because it's just very vaguely mentioned in the syllabus. But you can actually build a microbial mesocosm, which basically means it's all bacteria. So you actually don't grow a plant in it. You rely solely on bacteria. And when you do that, it's called a Winogradsky column. And it comes into a little bit of stuff that we looked at in B4 in terms of aerobic and anaerobic, because you can actually end up seeing kind of a gradient made where you can see the aerobic bacteria at the top and anaerobic able to form in this kind of darker bottom level of it. So it's a cool way of kind of seeing a sustainable ecosystem only of bacteria and also of looking at kind of different levels of aerobic conditions. Okay, so that's kind of a little bit of an intro. From there, I want to talk about what are some applications. And in particular, there's kind of two areas that we're going to kind of, well, they're actually both related to the similar idea. But particularly looking at kind of this idea of recycling of nutrients being really important. And one of the requirements for that is that we cannot just remove biomass all the time, because when biomass is being removed, those nutrients are not being recycled. And so one of the ways that that happens is when humans over-harvest areas, where all harvesting does a threat to that. So we're going to look a little bit at, given this, two really important things are that we're doing sustainable harvesting and sustainable agriculture. So we're setting up kind of a process that allows the ecosystems that we're using for food source to be sustainable. So that's kind of our two applications, and there'll be some things that come off of that. And then the last thing will be succession, which is the only HL kind of component. All right. Okay, so this is kind of, I'm just going to call it applications. I'm not sure what else to call it exactly. So applications of sustainability or applications of these concepts. So essentially, how do we need to take this on board? So first of all, like I said, we need to make sure that we're using sustainable harvesting practices. Particularly, like we said, because we are removing biomass when we harvest things of a resource. So when we talk about this one, I want to look at kind of how we handle that for like one specific resource. And then when we talk agriculture, we'll then kind of branch out to on a bigger scale. So it's not very complicated, but basically the principle is when we are doing harvesting, we have to ensure that the rate of replacement is greater than the rate of removal. So that's kind of your rule of thumb, is that we have to make sure that the rate of replacement, so it's making new organisms at a faster rate than you are removing it. And if that's the case, then you should be able to keep removing it because the regeneration rate is high. Really tricky to obtain, and so there are some tricks in terms of seeds and planting and so forth. It tells you have to know 2 examples. It doesn't say specifically which ones, just a tree example and a animal example. So that means it won't ask for it by name, but it could ask you to give an example. So we'll just do 2 examples. So our plant example that's interesting is black cherry trees. These are both interesting examples because they were kind of highly sought after by humans, which is what led to the problem. So because they look pretty in furniture, what ended up happening was they were doing clear cutting. So when you do clear cutting, you're removing trees of kind of every age. So you're removing trees that are still being really valuable in terms of producing seeds and so forth, and then creating an environment where there's no opportunity for replacement. So our lesson, don't do clear cutting. So you need to do kind of like strategic logging, whereby you only remove certain trees that are older and potentially not producing seeds anymore and things like that. So there are ways to be sustainable loggers, but clear cutting is not it. The fish example that we talked about, there's plenty of them, but one example is the Chilean sea bass, which is a fish that was basically discovered, thought to be delicious, and then kind of boomed. And then one of the things that they actually did that was bad was long line fishing, where they put like a whole bunch of, I don't know fishing terms very well, little hooks, all on one and like dumped a whole bunch. So then it again is kind of relates that over harvesting, taking way more than can be replaced. It also was trapping birds, which is sad, so don't do that. So good lessons. Okay, so those are just some kind of isolated examples. The bigger one is looking at kind of sustainable agriculture. So when we talk agriculture, we are referring to both the growing and the removing of crops. So we're looking at not just kind of removing things from established ecosystems, but basically like planting and removing as a kind of joint process. So it's a little bit of a bigger issue than just the single ones. And there's several different issues here. So I'm going to go through a list of kind of considerations, and there's 2 I'm going to talk more about that hit bigger kind of issue. So some considerations that we need to think about when we're establishing agriculture. So one of them, and which is one I'm going to talk more about, is the use of fertilizer. So we need to consider reducing fertilizer use. And that's for essentially because of eutrophication. So we'll talk about that next. Another thing is we need to look at making sure erosion of valuable topsoil isn't happening. So one example is to use cover crops to avoid erosion. And particularly the erosion of the topsoil that's more nutrient rich. So in between harvesting seasons, leaving something there is a really good practice. Doing things like reducing leaching, which is essentially water going away, grabbing nutrients and going away from where it can actually be used. And that's actually linked to fertilizer use. So essentially that is going to require better irrigation. So I'm just going to make a note of that. So being more careful with how water is used in farming. to avoid it taking and dissolving your nutrients and then removing them. So it's actually somewhat linked to fertilizer use, so we'll kind of link those two together in a minute. What else I say? In general, we need to reduce the carbon footprint. And one way we can do that is by avoiding kind of mechanical uses. So like mechanical tillage is bad. So when we like prepare the grounds that are using mechanical means for that, that's bad. And then the last one is to be really careful about agrochemicals. So that's going to be things like pesticides. And so we're going to talk about those as our other one. So there's essentially two that we're going to put a little spotlight on as kind of a linking into our other issues. So first of all, we're going to talk about why decreasing fertilizer use is so important. And the answer is because of its role in eutrophication. And then the other one that we're going to talk about is why is it really important to manage agrochemicals or pesticides. And the reason is because, I'm going to go over here, because of biomagnification. So when we actually introduce those, they cause a lot of kind of further on consequences down trophic levels. So those are kind of two further issues we're going to talk about. So you need to be able to explain those two in a little bit more detail. Like the rest of this is kind of just knowing in general, but these two I would like you to be able to account for a little bit more clearly in terms of how it actually happens. So let's do eutrophication first. So basically what happens with eutrophication is that there's an increase in fertilizer use. And that's because fertilizers provide fixed nitrogen. So they are really helpful for plants because plants use nitrogen to grow new proteins. So when we use fertilizers, we provide them with fixed nitrogen. But particularly if we're using too much fertilizer use, then what happens is that fertilizer use runs off into bodies of water. And that can be just naturally, but it can also be made worse by leaching. So if we're not careful with how we water areas, then that kind of contributes to that. So that is going to run off, and so as a result, there's going to be excess nitrogen in our water sources. So I don't know why I wrote water bodies. You can just write oceans, but now I've written it, I'm not going to erase it. And then again, that nitrogen seems good because that nitrogen is really beneficial for plants. So what happens is particularly algae and oceans. So that's good for producers. So they're going to grow, but they actually overgrow. So again, if we don't overuse it, it's fine. But when we have that really high level of it, it ends up causing the overgrowth of algae. And a lot of times you'll see that called algal blooms at the surface of the water. So particularly right at kind of the water's surface, because that's usually where more of the nitrogen is, you'll get this kind of overgrowth. When that happens, the consequence is that actually is bad because it creates it blocks light, and the overpopulation creates competition, and basically they can't all survive, particularly the algae that are lower down. So when you have this really big bloom at the top, the ones that are lower, lower ones are not going to get the light they need, and they're not able to compete. So then what happens is that creates a situation where algae start to die. Then when the algae dies, what we then have is a situation where we need to recycle their nutrients. So due to the algal death, there's an increased need for decomposition. And that increased decomposition is generally done by bacteria that are in the water. And bacteria bacteria, when they do decomposition, decomposition requires cellular respiration. So when bacteria are undergoing decomposition, it requires energy. So it is an energy requiring process. So doing decomposition causes cellular respiration to happen. So when you have kind of lots of decomposition, those decomposers are going to increase their amount of cellular reproduction, or cellular respiration, sorry. And that is going to increase the amount of oxygen that they need. So that actually increases what's called the BOD, which is the biochemical oxygen demand. So basically that is just saying that it's increasing the amount of O2 used by decomposers. And when the decomposers are using all of that O2, it gets used up. And then as a result, what we have is we have lower oxygen supplies in the water. And then the animals that rely on that for their cellular respiration don't have the oxygen they need, and then animals die from lack of oxygen. One thing that's really important is just in general, this, like explaining this line is actually really crucial. That's probably the line that most students miss. So they kind of go straight from overgrowth of algae to less oxygen, fish die. But if you want to get kind of full marks, you have to be able to spell out that middle line and actually explain how that relates to it. Okay, so that is one of the big issues that came up. The other one that we need to look at is biomagnification. So when we talk about biomagnification, we're talking about these kind of microchemicals. So pesticides is just one example of this. It can happen with other things. So the examples that were kind of listed, which was mercury, which is actually not related to pesticides. That's just a pollution, a general pollutant that's just happening by plants. But an actual pesticide example is DDT, which is actually an insecticide, which was actually used for malaria. And then the other example that can follow this is microplastics, which can come from macroplastics as well. So agrochemicals can do this, plus all of these others. I'm probably working hard to try to make biomagnification fit in with my flow chart by linking it to agrochemicals, but it'll work. So anytime we're using kind of aggressive chemicals, we run the risk of biomagnification. So what is biomagnification? So essentially what happens is small quantities of chemicals are absorbed by small organisms. And usually the most common example we see of these is things like phytoplankton or zooplankton, so kind of organisms living in aquatic things. And then even though at the small amount, it's not dangerous itself, but they get kind of absorbed into their tissues. And so if they're absorbed into their tissues, that means they're able to be passed on to a consumer. And then what happens is, when we look at larger animals, they actually eat more biomass, so they end up with quite a lot of it. So larger animals consume larger amounts. And I did like a full diagram of this in class. I'm just trying to consolidate, so hopefully this works as an explanation. So larger animals consume more biomass. So they consume more of these tissues that contains the chemical. And so they actually end up with more of the chemical than the others, so that increases the chemical in their body. And then this just keeps happening. So as you go up the food chain, everyone that is a bigger organism tends to eat more, and so this just continues to happen. So essentially this continues all the way up the food chain. So we're going to say continues up the food chain. And essentially the concentration of the chemical increases at each level. At each trophic level, because of the fact that they are generally consuming more biomass. So larger animals have larger energy needs, so they're consuming more biomass to meet their needs, and then those tissues contain more, and then by the top of the food chain, it can be dangerous. So the levels can actually be detrimental at the top of the food chain. Okay, so that's biomagnification. Last little thing, and I have it in really tiny amount of space, so eek, because I used up too much space with all this. But we will do succession really quickly. Succession is the HL only component of this section. So if HL, you're not doing HL, you do not need to revise this material. And so we'll just kind of go through it fairly quickly. Succession's not overly difficult, so it's just kind of one of those random ones that got placed in as HL only. Okay, so ecological succession. So we're going to put a little HL to remind us that this is a higher level concept. And then we will say ecological succession. So just a quick definition of what we mean by ecological succession. So we are referring to the predictable stages of growth or regrowth in an ecosystem. So predictable stages, meaning it's always going to happen in kind of the same order. And it can be primary growth or it can be regrowth in an ecosystem. And it's triggered by some sort of change in either, so kind of each of the stages are triggered by abiotic and biotic changes. So abiotic changes will lead to changes in the biotic community changes in some way the abiotic community, and so they kind of both impact one another, leading to this kind of predictable steps. Okay, so two different types of it. So when we say growth for the first time, we're talking primary succession. So when we're talking primary succession, this is going to be the first time there's been life on that surface. So first establishment of life on what is usually like rock, often formed by lava, as an example of something that could form new rock. So there's a volcanic eruption, we have new rock that's never been in that area before, and so now we need to have life. There are other examples. Other things can lead to it, including things like erosion and so forth. But that is just a really kind of common example that you'll see for this. And so if that is going to be the case, it's going to have to go through some stages to create soil. So the first thing that needs to happen is that on the rock, you need to have your pioneer species. And those pioneer species are usually lichens and moss. And they actually are really important because A, they're small, so they don't use a root system. So they're like a carpet, so they don't have that need to obtain a lot of things from soil. And so they're really simple organisms that can actually sustain life in really inhospitable environments. And they actually secrete enzymes that are going to actually erode the rock or the lava hardened to make kind of cracks, and then in those cracks essentially like recycled nutrients to build up. So nutrients kind of establish, and then you kind of essentially create soil. And that's kind of our key. So you need to break down the rock, and then you need to kind of gather as the lichens and moss kind of die. Then they can actually kind of gather material in there, and then kind of establish those nutrients. And then now you have soil. And then once you have soil, other plant life can move into the area. Once you actually have a decent amount of plant life, so once you have like kind of an increase in your plant life, the result of that is you start actually creating enough food for an ecosystem. So you can phrase that as an increase in the primary productivity. So we actually have enough glucose to sustain living organisms. Once you have enough primary productivity, then your consumers can move in. And you can start to develop more and more complex food webs until eventually you reach kind of your highest point, which is your kind of peak high biodiversity and stability. So a couple things we want to add to that. So first of all, so that's kind of the general pattern. So that's all for primary succession. Secondary succession refers to the regrowth. So when we say secondary succession, there's been a previous ecosystem, but some sort of damage. So it's following damage to a previous ecosystem. And then a lot of times that damage is like a forest fire. So we already had an ecosystem, but it was damaged in some way. And so when that happens, secondary succession doesn't have to go all the way back to the beginning. It basically starts here. So it starts with the plant life moving in, because the key is the soil remains. So we don't have to rebuild the soil, because the soil will still be there with seeds and everything in it. So it's otherwise the same kind of concept as primary succession, but it starts kind of later down the line. So it starts there. Last thing is, let's define this point where you have peak biodiversity and stability. That's going to be your climax community. And that should, in theory, remain stable until you have some sort of damage like a forest fire, and then you could start over again with secondary succession. Remember, secondary succession isn't just the second time, it's any rebuilding. Two little dot points to add to our climax community. First of all, there are some instances where there is not one stable climax community. So it can be a cycle of multiple kind of established ecosystems. And that's cyclical succession. Not a ton of examples of that, but it is listed in your course as something to know. So a wood pasture is an example of that, whereby essentially it will grow up into a forest, but then as the trees start to die, it'll actually clear into a open pasture, and then as the open pasture facilitates seed growth, it goes back into a forest, and it just cycles all the time, so it doesn't stay as a forest, it's predictably going through a cycle. So that's one kind of thing, and then the other thing to note is that in some cases, it may arrest or stop at an earlier stage due to human interference. And that's often happens with farmland is a good example. So what can happen with farmland is that it never has a chance to become a forest, because the overgrazing of the farmland means it is kind of deliberately held in an earlier stage, and it does not advance to its climax community intentionally. Another example of that is peat bogs, and so sometimes swamps are drained to try to keep them from developing into that ecosystem, and so it doesn't reach its potential ecosystem because we've kind of halted or arrested it in a stop. Or sometimes ecosystems go in the wrong direction because of human interference as well. So I know that was pretty quick through succession, but the main thing is that you do understand the difference between primary and secondary. You understand these steps here, why that's really important to establish it, and then you understand this idea that essentially the more plant life you have, the further it can develop into an ecosystem. So pretty small little dot point, but definitely worth knowing. Okay, I'm going to erase that, and then we do still have one more. So D4 does have 3 kind of separate categories, so we'll come back with climate change. Okay, so last part of this is climate change, which does link to the other 2 parts because we've already talked a little bit about how climate change is affecting sustainability, and then also climate change is one of the things that can affect natural selection because it can alter the abiotic factors. So it kind of fits into each category. So let's just start with something that came up previously in C4, but let's just note that we know that consistently data such as the Keeling curve has shown a correlation between carbon dioxide levels, so between high CO2, so increasing CO2, and increasing temperatures. So that is kind of empirically kind of backed that there is a correlation. So there is a relationship between them. However, remember, correlation does not itself give causation. So we want to then be able to say, but okay, well, what might that relationship be? So for us to actually be able to state that there is in fact a causal relationship, we need to be able to have some sort of explanation. So be able to provide some sort of explanation for why, for what the mechanism is. And so that explanation, so we need an explanation for why there would be a relationship. And that explanation we know and understand is the greenhouse effect. So that explanation for what is the relationship is related to the greenhouse effect. So if we're talking CO2 and climate change, we basically have a theoretical explanation, greenhouse effect, and we have a data-based kind of proof. So we kind of have 2 things. This is how we understand it, and this is support for that in the form of data. Okay, so let's try and outline, make sure we understand this. The old course was a little bit more detailed in terms of explaining the radiation. So I don't know how much they're going to ask you for this level of detail, but it doesn't hurt to be able to make sure you could give more. So basically, the sun emits what is called shortwave radiation. So I'm going to write that in blue because ultraviolet, blue coloration is an example. So it's going to have shortwave radiation. And that includes all our visible light plus UV radiation. So that's just an example we know that the sun is emitting, plus all of our visible light. That ultraviolet and spectrum shortwave light is absorbed by the surface of the Earth. So that is absorbed by Earth's surface. Then Earth's surface, having absorbed that light, that warmed surface then actually re-emits or radiates back. So it's actually going to re-emit the light. So it takes the light and then bounces it back, but in a different form. So that warmed surface, because it has taken in that heat, it then has to transfer it back. It then re-emits the light. So, but it's going to re-emit it as long wave radiation. So the sun emits short wave, but when the Earth re-emits it, it is actually re-emitted in a different form, which is infrared radiation. So long wave radiation. And that long wave radiation is actually what's bounced off Earth, infrared. That's actually the important one because that's actually the one that is trapped by greenhouse gases. So that infrared radiation, that is then trapped by greenhouse gases near the surface of Earth, surrounding Earth. So that's essentially the role that the greenhouse gases play. So it's easy to just say, well, more CO2, but they actually are trapping that re-emitted heat. And then what they do by trapping it, it actually holds on to the heat, and that trapped heat warms Earth. So I always give the example, it's like using a blanket. So when you put a nice heavy blanket on you, if you are camping, then it will hold your body heat in, and so it will trap the heat, and that is a good thing. But what is happening now is that we're having an increase in the greenhouse gases. So all of this is just kind of explanation. The key is actually this bottom part here. So this is actually, this part here is really the key part. So what's happening now is we're having an increase in greenhouse gas emission. So we're having more greenhouse gases. If you have more greenhouse gases, then you're going to have an increase in the trapped infrared radiation. And because that is what is actually warming Earth, then that is going to be an increased warming of Earth. And that, and all of its many consequences, which we will get to, so that increased warming of Earth, that is what we refer to as climate change, because it has a lot of follow-on effects from that. So when we say greenhouse gases, we need to make sure we know that the primary one, of course, is CO2. So the most significant one is CO2. CO2 is important because it's in large concentrations and it has a long half-life, so it stays for a really long time. There are others, including even water vapor, but it has a really short kind of half-life, so it doesn't stay very long, so it doesn't tend to cause big problems. So the most substantial other one that we generally talk about is methane, which is CH4, and that can be emitted by fossil fuel burning, a few other things that actually emit methane. Your course doesn't have a huge emphasis on it, but it's worth knowing it as kind of a second backup one. Okay, so then the next thing we're going to look at, kind of before I erase that, is then what's happening is that once it's begun, is actually continuing via a positive feedback loop. So once this has started, so once you've had some warming, it's actually creating its own self-sustaining cycle. So once started, it is continuing via a positive feedback loop. And what that basically means is just more gives more. So the more warming you have, the more warming you have, and so forth. So there's kind of three little mini examples I want to look at in terms of positive feedback loops that are worth knowing, that have varying levels of kind of complexity. So we'll kind of look at two example ones first. So we have warmer temps. And we already established that that was from everything we just talked about. Those warmer temps are then causing snow to melt. Or even to have less snowfall in other areas. And so that snow melting or kind of permafrost melts, I might put them separate. So these are both similar, but we'll look at kind of two different aspects of it. So when snow melts, we have more kind of dark ground exposed. And when dark ground is exposed, dark ground actually absorbs more heat. So dark ground actually has I always get these confused, lower albedo, which is ability to reflect light. So it reflects less light. So it reflects less and absorbs more heat. And when it absorbs more heat, then the result is more warmer temperatures. And then it just starts over. So then that essentially further creates more of the same problem. Similar one with the permafrost. So what's happening with the permafrost, when we melt the permafrost, that actually releases methane itself. So melting permafrost tends to have chemicals trapped into it because it's kind of frozen soil. So it actually releases methane, which is a greenhouse gas. And when we increase the amount of methane that we release, we increase the greenhouse effect. And then, oh no, when we increase the greenhouse effect, we go back to increasing the warmer temperatures. So those are kind of positive feedback loops. There's one more that kind of relates to the forest, so similar thing to this. So we have warmer temps. The other thing that can happen is not just that snow melts, but less snow is formed. So less snowfall, so this tends to be slightly lower areas. And when you have less snowfall, then you have less melting of snow, and so you actually have less H2O. So we actually rely, I am not the boreal forest, but the boreal forest relies on snowfall for its water. So when you have less water as a result, that causes drought. When you have drought, you have forest fires. And when you have forest fires, you have less plant life. And when you have less plant life, you have less photosynthesis, more CO2. I'm just going to try to consolidate that. Less plants, less photosynthesis, therefore more CO2. So that's another kind of example, and that's one we'll kind of mention it briefly in our one below. In our specific examples, but that's kind of what's happening in the taiga at the moment, is that exact positive feedback loop. So all kind of similar, but those are just 3 different positive feedback loops that are all happening. Okay, so for the next section, which is kind of a chunk of it, what I'm going to actually do is just go through the specific examples in the course. So you kind of need to understand kind of what's happening, and then there's just a lot of, and also it messed up this, and also it messed up this, and also messed up this. So I'm just going to go through every named consequence that you need to know for kind of covering everything. And then that will kind of wrap up. So that's basically how it is. So it's likely to essentially ask you about one of these specific applications, but then wanting you to go from the specific consequence to go back to what we just talked about, which is how did climate change cause it. So this is what caused climate change, then these are the consequences. So these are the specific consequences you could be asked about. So these are consequences, not causes. Okay, so let's look at what they are. So first one, we're going to say, here's the consequence, here's who's impacted by it. So first one is reduced land fast and sea ice. So land fast is specifically ice that is attached to land. Sea ice is more the large glaciers kind of floating near land, but not necessarily attached. And that is bad for 2 people. It is bad for 2 organisms, penguins and walruses. So less breeding grounds for penguins, so particularly emperor penguins. So as a result, they're kind of sheets of ice that they're supposed to be able to kind of protect their young on, or breaking off, going out into the ocean and then killing the young. It's very sad. And then kind of longer distances for walruses to hunt. And that's leading to the walruses basically getting exhausted and dying from exhaustion or not being able to get enough food back to their young. So those are both direct consequences of those kind of polar changes. Next one was what we just kind of talked about with the boreal forest, but we'll come back to it. So essentially reduced snowfall in the boreal forest. And so I'm not going to restate the whole little this cause this cause this is this. Just basically stating that that is resulting in kind of drought and forest fires and tree loss. And then what's essentially happening is because of the loss of plant life, the forest used to be what we call a carbon sink. So what was previously a carbon sink, meaning it actually absorbed carbon. So it took in carbon. So it actually removed carbon from the atmosphere, is now a carbon source, which means it's adding carbon. So it actually adds CO2 instead of removes it. So that's really bad because we're not only adding, like we're losing a source of removing carbon. And that point where the source becomes a sink is called a tipping point. So we use that term in a different context in terms of sustainability, but if we use it in climate change, that often refers to that source to our sink to source kind of changeover. So that's another kind of specific consequence. So moving on from land ones to ocean ones. So one thing that's happening as a result of the increased temperatures is there's warmer surface water in oceans. So because of the overall atmospheric temperature being greater, the water at the top of the oceans is warmer. That's actually creating what's called increased stratification. Which means the layers of the ocean are more dramatic. So there's a bigger gap between the warmer and the colder. So a larger kind of warmer section, and that actually reduces currents. So there's less ocean currents, which is probably the bigger one to know versus the specific term stratification. And then what's important is that the currents are actually necessary for what's called nutrient upwelling. So the current is supposed to deliver the colder nutrient-rich water up to the kind of surface area water. So that's less nutrient upwelling. And that's really bad for essentially life in the upper parts, which is a lot of the life. So less nutrient upwelling from cold water. And that is essentially bad for life near the surface. I don't know if I wrote that in the nicest way. I'm trying to clarify it, but essentially we need to bring the nutrients up for the organisms that are trying to live on the surface of the water. And when we don't have a current, then the nutrients stay trapped below, and the organisms that are trying to survive in that top part, which is a lot of organisms, aren't getting the nutrient cycling that they need. So lack of nutrient upwelling is our kind of issue there. That's really important. Okay, two more that are everyone, and then 2 HL only ones. So migration is another one. So migration of species specifically to seek coolness. So basically those is kind of defined as, I should probably also define it as kind of range changes. So their ranges have shifted. So sometimes you'll see it referred to as range kind of changes. And there's 2 general patterns that we see. One is poleward migration, which is movement towards the poles. And that's kind of all organisms that use coolness as an adaptation. We're seeing that in. And then the other one is upslope migration. And that's just a specific term for animals that live in mountains. So that's for montane species. So that's just throwing some fun vocab words at you there. So make sure you know what upslope migration is compared to poleward. It just means you're not going changing your latitude, you're changing your altitude. So poleward is a change in latitude, and upslope is a change in altitude. So there's some geography terms for you. Okay, and then last one, like I said, that is for everyone, and then we'll do a quick HL terms only, a couple of HL examples. So the last one is in the oceans, ocean acidification. So let's chat a little bit, probably need a little bit more detail on that one. So let's clarify what's happening. So increased atmospheric CO2 in the air dissolves into the ocean. So then we have more CO2 in the ocean. What happens is when that happens, CO2 and water join together to make H2CO3. But then what happens then is that H2CO3 actually loses its hydrogen atoms and becomes carbonate. So that's actually carbonate right there. These are creating a lower pH and makes the water generally acidic. Then this carbonate, to deal with this, ends up joining with a hydrogen and actually becomes bicarb, which is slightly more stable. But what's happening is that other carbonate that was in the ocean is also going to help with that other one. And so in general, what's happening is more carbonate is actually being used to form bicarb instead of calcium carbonate. So more carbonate, which is what that is being used to form bicarb instead of calcium carbonate. So that's kind of the real effect, is essentially the acidic environment is actually causing a chemical reaction to happen that's actually using the calcium, the carbonate. And so as a result, we have low amounts of this. So the result is low calcium carbonate. And that's really important because calcium carbonate is used by coral for their exoskeletons. So as a result of having low calcium carbonate, we are finding that there are weaker or no new skeletons, so they cannot form their exoskeletons, and then we're basically essentially going to cause a extinction of coral species, so damage to coral species. If you remember from B4, there's all kinds of fun extra stuff you can talk about with coral, because in addition, when they have higher temperatures, they expel their zooanthally, so then they also lose their photosynthetic buddies. So there's actually kind of more than just that, but that's really the one that comes up here in D4. So that's kind of the main thing. If that's a little bit confusing for you here, the main thing is just that you know essentially that we're having low calcium carbonate. So if this is a bit like, woo, just at least learn this. So ideally understand the chemistry behind it, but as a minimum, just be able to say, due to the CO2, we're seeing less calcium carbonate, and as a result, that's harmful to them. Okay, 2 extra ones that are actually HL only, so I'm out of room, so I'll just erase to make room for those, and then we'll wrap up with a little, end on a happy note, of what are some things that can be done in terms of how can we kind of address this. Okay, so last 2 things to talk about is basically looking at trophic mismatches and then doing insect life cycles. So these are actually both continuing with our kind of consequences, but these are our HL consequences. So 2 new ones. So one of the consequences is that organisms that used to be in sync are falling out of sync because of climate change impacting one of their life cycles and not the other. So we're going to refer to that as trophic mismatch. Due to asynchrony, which is out of sync, of phenological events. Phenological is just time-based, so time-based annual events. So events that happen kind of cyclically. No longer synchronized in these timely events. It says you're supposed to know 2 examples. We're just going to do one together because this is the only named one, which is looking at a plant life that is used by reindeer. And so again, just to kind of simplify it, it has some sort of weird name, like something ear. Sorry, I didn't even write it down. But basically, warmer, so plant life in the Arctic is basically, I'm trying to think of a good way of saying it, grows based on temp. Meanwhile, reindeer migration is based on daylight length. And so what's happening is that climate change is impacting one but not the other. So this is where you can get these mismatches. So this is impacted by climate change. But daylight hours are actually not directly impacted by climate change. So that one is not happening. It's not changing. So then as a result, what's happening is that they're actually growing earlier every year. So because of the warmer temperatures, that's happening earlier. And then reindeer are basically breeding too late. So reindeer are breeding too late, and their babies are not having as much food source. So they're breeding too late for maximum food. So it's not good for their offspring because they're missing the peak season of their food source, because their food source has shifted season, but they have not because they use daylight hours instead of temperature, which used to be aligned, but now one is changing because of climate change and one is not. So that's an example of lots of fancy words, but basically just trying to explain that synchrony between different trophic levels being really important. The other HL only specific one is related to insect life cycles, but it's really just one specific one that you need to know. And so that's basically happening to spruce bark. So death of spruce trees due to bark beetles. So bark beetles always burrow in the spruce tree as part of when they lay eggs. So burrow during egg laying. So burrows during egg laying are damaging. But previously it only happened once a year, so the tree could essentially sustain that without collapse. But now warmer temps are allowing 2 life cycles a summer. And so instead of them only creating 1 lot of baby beetles a summer, they're now creating 2 because it's staying warm long enough that they can. And that basically means more burrows, more damage, trees die. And essentially it's causing the trees to die. So it's just kind of an interesting impact whereby what's happening in one species is having an impact on another on kind of a bigger scale. Okay, so just to end with, are there any solutions? So what are the solutions to all of this? And there was, we didn't really run out of time for it a bit in the previous one. So we'll look at kind of 2 different solutions that came up 2 different places. So in terms of climate change, carbon sequestration, I don't know if I'm even saying that right, which basically means we need some ways of removing carbon. So we need things in place that actually essentially remove some of the CO2. And so there's three things that were mentioned, and these are really just straightforward vocab words. Essentially, if we want to remove CO2, we primarily need trees. So we can have afforestation, which is just essentially planting seeds in new location. So it can be where there's never been a forest on a farmland, giving incentives to actually turning it into a forest instead. We can have reforestation, which is basically just kind of helping recover kind of damaged forest. And then the other thing that is helpful is peat bogs. So when we're swampy areas that trap decomposed matter can actually form new fossil fuels. So instead of burning fossil fuels, we can rebuild some through peat. And so we can preserve peat bogs by lowering the water drainage by not draining. So what tends to happen is we tend to drain the water to create less swampy areas and use the land for other reasons. But as a result, we prevent the peat from forming. So the peat has to have kind of these waterlogged conditions. So we need to let the waterlogging occur in order to protect it. So they need waterlogged areas. And so we need to not drain the waterlogging to actually allow that to happen. Just like I said, one little vocab word that we didn't get a chance to really talk about in the other one is just a reminder that reforestation would be an example of rewilding. And so rewilding is another thing that's really important to try to help preserve natural ecosystems. So when we do rewilding, these are techniques that are used to kind of restore natural ecosystems. And so that kind of comes back to our last one, more about ecosystem sustainability. But rewilding are various efforts to basically restore and regenerate ecosystems. And so that does come into, that can be a form of carbon sequestration as well. And remember, rewilding can be like actually replanting, or it can just be things like removing invasive species, hunting bans, things like that. So just a quick word, it's come up before anyway, but just that's another thing that's important, is coming up with strategies to preserve the areas that we do have and try to protect those ecosystems. And so rewilding can include kind of, I guess I'm just gonna quickly give two more examples. So that can be a matter, so it can be things like replanting trees, reforestation. It can also include examples like returning keystone species to areas that have lost their keystone species. And it can also include things like removing invasive species. So those are strategies, been going too long, strategies that are in place to kind of help sustain ecosystems. So that's probably a slightly more broad thing related to the previous topic, but reforestation is an example both of a carbon sequestration, but also an example of a rewilding technique. So it can work for either. All right, so that was D4. Best of luck.